So the first several chapters of Isaiah are really this roller coaster of highs and lows, ups and downs, pure dread, and then pure joy, and then back to pure dread again. So before we can really wrap our minds around what happens in Isaiah chapter 6, I think we've got to back up and get some context from Isaiah chapter 5. Here in Isaiah chapter 5, Isaiah starts by singing a song, telling a story in essence. And it goes a little bit like this. So I've got this friend. He's a really good friend, and he buys this plot of land, and it's perfect for a vineyard. Its location right there on the hill, the weather in this region, really, it is the best spot imaginable. And then he gets this vineyard, and my friend goes to work. He starts digging throughout the vineyard and getting it just right for the grapes that he wants to grow there. He moves through the whole vineyard and he clears out all of these stones. Then he goes and buys the best, the most choice grapes that he can imagine. And really, they're supposed to be some of the best variety in the entire world. And then he plants them right there in this perfect vineyard setting. Then he goes and he establishes this watchtower in the middle of it. It's this great security system that he might be able to notice everybody who comes in and out of the vineyard. Then he also sets up a wine press right there on site so that he can produce the wine as soon as he harvests the grapes. Everything's looking great. This is quite a production, quite an ordeal. And then he waits, and he waits. And then as his vines grow and his grapes begin to produce, they're terrible. I mean, it's all stink fruit. So what's the point of the story? Well, it's at this point that Isaiah sort of pulls back the curtain and he says, God is the vineyard owner and the people of Israel. You, O Israel, are the vineyard. And then Isaiah uses this little play on words in Hebrew to talk about how terrible the people of Israel had become. He says, God looked to his vineyard. He looked to his people. And while he expected correction, instead, carnage. While he looked for the upright, instead, an uproar. There is no hope. There is no peace. There is no resolution. There is no restoration for the people of Israel on their own. And it's in the midst of this context that we get to Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah's call into ministry. So Isaiah chapter 6 takes place in the year of Uzziah's death. Now, King Uzziah reigned on the throne for 50 years. Can you even imagine having one king for 50 years? But he dies. And in the year that he dies, Isaiah tells us that he's praying. He's uncertain about what's going to happen next. I'm sure it's a time of political uncertainty and chaos. And then all of a sudden, boom, he's transported into this vision and he tells us what he sees. He says, I looked and I saw a throne. Who sits on thrones? Kings. Except this king is larger and more massive than any earthly king. It's God himself. His power is evident from the moment Isaiah sees him. And he's so huge, he's so massive that the hem of his garment just twists and curls around the whole building. And then there's these creatures that are zipping around. They're flying, and then the word used to describe them is seraphim, and it means either burning one or snake, or maybe some sort of combination of the two. So there's these flying, burning, snaky things that are zipping around from one place to another. They've got wings over their face and wings over their feet, and then they're shouting out to each other, holy, holy, holy. I mean, yes, in this strange vision, the snakes are talking. It's not even the weirdest part of the whole thing. And at the sound of all of this, the whole building starts to shake and fill with smoke. And Isaiah thinks he is about ready to die. Now, maybe it would help us to understand a little bit more of what Isaiah's seeing. You see, in Isaiah's world, the holiest place in the whole nation, the whole world really, was the center of the temple. It was what was known as the Holy of Holies. One day, every year, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, into the most holy presence of God himself. And yet what Isaiah is seeing here is some sort of mashup between the Holy of Holies and the throne room, the very throne room of God himself. But the problem is that Isaiah has not gone through the proper purification rituals. Isaiah is not even wearing holy garments. In fact, Isaiah isn't even a priest. He's exactly where he isn't supposed to be. And Isaiah knows what happens to people who show up in holy places without proper preparation. They die. So, random question. Have you ever had a dream where you're not wearing any pants? Maybe it's a little bit awkward, but surely you know what I'm talking about, right? You're giving some sort of presentation, or you're standing up in front of a group of people, or you're in a crowded place, and all of a sudden you look down in your dream and, oh no, you forgot to get dressed. In that moment, you rarely stop to process, now why did I not put any pants on this morning? Instead, you're just overcome by the horror of the situation, this terrible gut feeling that you are stuck right in the middle of something terrible, and there's very little that you can do about it. I imagine that Isaiah is having a similar feeling here. This overwhelming sense of dread because he knows exactly where he is standing, but also an overwhelming sense of dread because he's exposed. He can't hide. And all of a sudden, there in the full glory of God's presence, he is exposed. All of the sin and shame of his own people are exposed, and even that of Isaiah himself. So to us, maybe this sounds super cool, right? Isaiah gets to see God, this amazing light and sound show, flying, burning, snaky things, and he doesn't even have to leave the comfort of his own home, it seems. It all happens just in this vision. That's really cool. But we only think that because we weren't there. The intensity of Isaiah's experience has illuminated every deep and dark, sinful place of his land and of his own heart. He's utterly exposed. This is what the burning hot light of God's glory, of God's presence can do to us. I wonder if you've ever experienced that yourself. Have you ever been standing in the presence of God, or drawn into the presence of God, and have suddenly realized how completely, utterly sinful you are? So maybe we've begun then to wrap our minds around Isaiah's dilemma here. He's overwhelmed. He really thinks this might be the end. But it's at this moment that something crazy happens. One of those flying, burning, snaky things flies up to Isaiah, and in his hands he's got some tongs with a flaming, fiery coal taken from the altar, and he takes it and he touches Isaiah's lips with it. Now, why does he do that? Well, this flaming coal, it was taken from the altar, which in Isaiah's world is the place where you go in order to get sins taken care of. And because Isaiah is in God's presence and Isaiah needs cleansing, then the coal is intended to do just that. In fact, that's exactly what the snaky thing says to Isaiah. He says, look, your junk is taken care of. I want you to let this thing sink in for a moment, right? As abruptly as all of this started, the crisis is now over. Isaiah thought he was about ready to die. God recognized that he was unclean. And yet in this moment, God stepped in. He initiated the cleansing and he completed it. Isaiah is clean only because God has saved him. Now, we don't have time right here to really dwell on this, but I just want to remind you, brothers and sisters, this is our experience. We know the depth of our own sin in the light of God's presence, but Jesus has made a perfect sacrifice for us. And it covers everything. I mean, I want you to imagine this just for a moment. Imagine yourself in Isaiah's place. Imagine standing there in the full glory of God's presence and feeling the weight of your own sin and your own shame. And now, imagine one of those flying things coming up to you, taking that coal and searing your lips with it. And now, in that moment, listen to its words. Look, your junk is taken care of. This has touched onto your lips, and your sin has been covered by another. Now, we may start to protest. But what about the things that I've done? I mean, what about what I just did the other night? I'm not good enough for this cleansing. But if we've said yes to Jesus, then Jesus has carried away our sin and our shame. And because he has made atonement for us, God is no longer angry with us. God is no longer angry with you. In fact, I don't even think God is disgusted with you. In fact, I think God reaches down and he cups your face in his hands and he smiles at you. Can you see him smiling at you? If you said yes to Jesus, you're clean. That is some serious good news. So then, what happens once we have been cleansed? What happens once we have experienced this change? Well, now Isaiah hears God ask a couple of questions. Who will I send? Who will go for us? And Isaiah, fresh off this mind-bending, life-altering, world-transforming experience, just can't help himself, right? He's raising his hand and he says, here I am, send me. Now, if you've heard this story before, maybe you, like me, love this part, right? We're pumped, we're amped, we're ready to go. We're right there with Isaiah like, yes, here we go. Let's take on the world. As our college's president, Matt Proctor, says, we're ready to storm the gates of hell with a squirt gun. But then, listen to Isaiah's call. God says this, Isaiah, I want you to go and preach, but just so you know, the people aren't going to get it. Their hearts are hard. Their ears are all stopped up. And you know what? Your words are just going to make it worse. Well, that's a bummer of a call. I mean, that doesn't sound very noble or glamorous or really that exciting at all. That sounds like really hard work. And so Isaiah does what I think is a very logical thing. He asks God a follow-up question. How long do I got to do that for? And God says, until everything is pretty much destroyed, until the land is pretty much emptied, there will be a small portion that remains. This is not what Isaiah wanted to hear. So if the call is so difficult, if this task before him is so fruitless, it seems, why would Isaiah even go? Well, I think he goes because he has not been called to results, but to faithfulness as someone who has been changed. Here's, I think, where the context can help us a little bit. You see, Isaiah entered into all of this, covered in his own sin and shame, covered with the sin and shame of his own people. He was unclean, but then God stepped in, God initiated, God transformed him. And now, Isaiah's job is to go out as one who has been changed and transformed and to declare God's truth. I'm sure many throughout history have envied Isaiah's throne room experience, but I'm not sure many throughout history have envied the difficulty of Isaiah's call. Yet in reality, his ministry task is not altogether different from ours. You see, it's not about Isaiah converting anyone. It's not about Isaiah logging enough hours of evangelistic activity. It's not about him building up his congregation's weekly attendance, or perhaps even improving the quality of their weekend services. No. Instead, it's about Isaiah being faithful to the task that the God who sits on the throne has given to him. The God who changed him is the one who sends him out. You know, I think we could walk away from Isaiah chapter 6 with several different truths, but perhaps none more than this. God's presence changes us. And then God sends us out into the world with just one task: be faithful. So I wonder for you, how have you been changed? Think about the sin and the shame that you carried with you before you met Jesus. How has your experience with him changed and transformed who you are? And now, how does God want you to take that transformation and shine it out into the world right where God has placed you? What faithfulness has God set before you in the place where you live? transformation. That is the message of the gospel.